Autumn came early to the Bitterroot Valley that year, and with it came a silence that settled over the mountains like a held breath. The peaks to the north already wore their first crowns of white, and the sky hung low and gray above the pines, the kind of sky that old-timers said meant trouble was still deciding where to land. On the far edge of the valley, where the wind off the northern plains struck hardest and the land grew thin and stony, stood a small cabin that belonged to a widow named Sadie Whitlock. Word had just reached the town that her husband Amos, a poor but skilled carpenter, had died after a long and brutal bout of lung fever that no poultice or prayer could break. He left her little beyond that leaning cabin, a thin stack of firewood, a few rusted tools, and a plot of rocky ground that had never been kind to anyone who tried to farm it. When the townsfolk gathered at the burial, they offered the usual words, the kind spoken more out of habit than feeling, and then they turned back toward their own warm kitchens without a second glance. Warren Pike, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, murmured to Cole Brantley as they walked away that the widow wouldn't last until Christmas, and he said it the way a man says something he expects to be proven right. If you believe a single flower could never be strong enough to stop the deadliest blizzard a valley has ever seen, then stay until the very end of this story, because what happened in Bitterroot that winter would silence every man who ever laughed. The valley itself seemed to know what was coming before the people who lived in it did. Frost had already begun creeping along the fence rails each morning, and the creek that ran behind Sadie's property had started to skin over with a thin, brittle sheet of ice by midday. Amos had built that cabin with his own 2 hands more than a decade earlier, choosing the spot for its view of the eastern ridge rather than for any real protection from the weather, and Sadie had never once complained, because in those years his presence alone had been enough to keep the cold at bay. Now the same walls that had once felt snug and complete felt suddenly hollow, every draught and every creak amplified by the silence of a house, with only one heartbeat left inside it. She spent the first nights after the funeral simply listening, learning the sound of her own breathing in a room that used to hold 2. In the days that followed, Sadie walked into town to see Cole Brantley at the supply store, hoping to buy a little lumber, a handful of nails, and some tar paper to seal the gaps in her walls before the cold deepened. Cole shook his head before she had even finished speaking, telling her that winter was coming for everyone, and he could not extend credit to a widow with no money and no husband to vouch for her debt. She left without arguing, because arguing had never been her way, and she carried the refusal home the same quiet way she carried everything else. Dean Mercer, the town's carpenter, happened to pass by her cabin not long after, and stopped his wagon to look the place over with the practiced eye of a man who built houses for a living. He shook his head at the low roof line, at the thin northern wall, at a window set on the wrong side of the building entirely, and he told anyone who would listen that if a real storm ever hit that cabin, the snow would either bury it whole, or the wind would drive straight through every crack in the boards. Sadie heard the talk secondhand, through Naomi Vale, a young mother who was one of the only people in town who still looked at Sadie with something other than pity or contempt. She did not defend herself, and she did not cry in front of anyone, though at night, alone, by a fire that barely held its warmth, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her chest like a stone. The valley she now faced alone was not gentle to widows, and everyone in Bitterroot seemed to understand this, except for Sadie herself, who understood something else entirely. She had no money, no lumber, and no man to stand between her and the coming season, yet she did not spend those first weeks in despair the way the town expected her to. She spent them thinking, turning over old memories the way a person turns over stones looking for something buried underneath. The question that hung over the entire valley that autumn, whispered in the general store, and murmured after church, was simple and cruel. How could a penniless widow with no husband and no timber possibly survive a mountain winter alone? Nobody in Bitterroot had an answer for her, and nobody expected one, because in their minds the outcome was already written. But 3 states away, on a windswept plain she had crossed as a girl, an answer had been planted in her many years before, waiting patiently for the season it was needed most. That night, as the wind found every seam in the old cabin walls and hissed through them like something alive, Sadie sat close to her small fire and opened a wooden box that had belonged to her father. Inside lay a thin leather notebook, a handful of dried seeds wrapped in cloth, and pages of notes written in a hand she still recognized instantly after all these years. Her father had once guided wagon trains across the wind-scoured plains of Kansas, a place where lumber was scarce and money scarcer still, and where a man learned to build his defenses from whatever the earth was willing to give him. He had never built walls of stone or timber out there, because he never had the means, so instead he planted long rows of grass, dried cornstalks, willow branches, and towering sunflowers, arranging them to catch the snow before it ever reached a door or a wall. Sadie ran her fingers along one worn page and found a line she remembered from childhood, written in her father's careful hand, a single sentence that would come to define everything that followed. "Do not fight the storm at your doorstep," it read. "Make it fall before it ever reaches your wall." She remembered her father's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her, a low, patient voice that had never once raised itself in anger, even when the plains threw their worst at his wagon trains. He used to say that the prairie taught a person humility faster than any preacher could, because the wind did not care how strong a man believed himself to be. Sadie had been barely more than a girl when she last stood beside him on that open ground, watching him drive stakes into hard-packed earth and thread dried grass between them, while other travelers mocked the effort as a waste of good daylight. Those same travelers had huddled miserably through storms that her father's small camp weathered with far less suffering. And though he never once gloated over the difference, Sadie had never forgotten the lesson buried inside it. That sentence settled into her the way a seed settles into soil, and by the time the fire burned low, she understood something she had not understood before. The trouble with her cabin was never simply the cold. It was the wind itself, sweeping unbroken across open ground and slamming snow directly against the northern side of the house with nothing to slow it down. If she could build some kind of barrier a short distance in front of the cabin, something that could catch the wind and force it to drop its load of snow before reaching the walls, then the drifts would pile up harmlessly outside instead of burying her door, crushing her walls, or choking her chimney shut. She dug through the seed pouch her father had left behind and found what she was looking for. Giant sunflower seeds, the kind that grew tall and thick-stalked, with roots that ran deep and stems that turned hard and woody once the growing season ended. She had no money for lumber, but she had land, she had seeds, she had a coil of hemp rope, and most importantly, she still had a few months before the first real snow arrived to put her father's memory to the test. By the time spring turned into summer, Sadie had transformed the northern and northwestern edges of her property into something the valley had never seen before. She did not plant in neat, decorative rows the way a garden might be arranged. Instead, she staggered the seeds in overlapping lines, thick and irregular, the way a person builds a fence rather than a flower bed. Warren Pike rode past one afternoon and could not hold back his laughter, calling out to ask whether she planned to stare at flowers until she froze to death. Dean Mercer, standing outside his shop, told a group of men that any woman with sense would be planting potatoes instead of decorating her yard for a season she wasn't going to survive. Cole Brantley began spreading his own version of the story, suggesting that grief had finally taken its toll on the widow's mind, and soon the men of Bitterroot had a name for what she was building, calling it, with no small amount of mockery, the widow's flower wall. Sadie never once tried to explain herself, because she understood something the town did not. If she spoke of wind direction, of snowdrift patterns, of the pocket of still air that forms between two staggered barriers, they would only laugh harder, since proud men rarely listen to reason coming from a poor woman's mouth. Naomi Vale was the only one who ever stopped long enough to ask a real question, pausing her wagon one afternoon to ask what exactly Sadie thought she was building. Sadie looked up from her work and answered simply that she wasn't planting for autumn. She was planting for the dead of winter, for a month called January that hadn't yet arrived. The answer confused Naomi at first, but it was the kind of sentence that lodges itself in a person's memory and refuses to leave. And she found herself thinking about it again and again in the weeks that followed. By the height of summer, the sunflowers had grown taller than any man in the valley, their heavy golden heads swaying above the cabin roof like something out of an old and half-forgotten psalm. From a distance, the little house appeared to be ringed in a wall of living sunlight, strange and beautiful against the dull brown hills, and the children of Bitterroot took to riding past and calling it the widow's flower church, laughing as they went. Each morning she rose before the sun to check on the young plants, pulling weeds from around their bases and adjusting the stakes that held the tallest stalks upright against the early summer winds. Neighbors passing on the road grew used to the sight of her bent over the rows, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands stained green from the work, and most of them no longer bothered to slow their wagons for a second look. A few, like Cole Brantley, found it easier to simply avoid the road that passed her cabin altogether, uncomfortable with a sight they could not quite explain to themselves. The mockery had become so ordinary by midsummer that it barely registered as cruelty anymore. It was simply the way the town spoke of the widow at the edge of the valley, a habit as unremarkable as commenting on the weather. The scorn only grew louder as the season turned, and the louder it grew, the quieter and more determined Sadie became. When the flowers finally faded at the end of summer, the town assumed she would tear the withered stalks down the way any sensible gardener would clear a spent field. But Sadie did nothing of the sort. She let the plants stand exactly where they were, waiting patiently as the stems dried in the autumn air, turning from soft green flesh into something stubbornly tough and stubbornly. Once the drying was complete, she began the true work, gathering the stalks into bundles and lashing them together with hemp rope, weaving in dried willow branches, old cornstalks, and bundled grass to fill the gaps between them. The wall she built was never meant to be solid. She left narrow gaps throughout, small openings that would let the wind pass through slowly, rather than slam against a flat, unbroken surface. This was the piece of knowledge her father had carried across 1,000 miles of open plain. The understanding that a solid wall invites the wind to strike hard and then curl violently around itself, dropping its snow in a furious heap right against whatever stands behind it, while a loosely woven barrier robs the wind of its strength gradually, forcing it to release its snow well before it ever reaches a door. She placed the finished wall a short distance from the cabin itself, leaving several paces of open ground between the barrier and her home, a space that would become a pocket of still, protected air once the storms began. Beneath the base of the wall she packed dry straw, and around the roots of the bundled stalks she piled heavy stones, anchoring everything against the gusts that would soon try to tear it loose. Inside the cabin, nothing from the summer's harvest went to waste. She saved the dried flower heads and threshed them for seed, keeping some for her own table, some to feed the few chickens she still had, and pressing a portion into a crude oil, she rubbed into the gaps of her cabin walls to seal them against the cold. The smallest, thinnest stalks became kindling for her fire, and the dried leaves were packed into cloth sacks and laid along the base of her interior walls for extra insulation. Dean Mercer happened to ride by while she was lashing the dried stalks into place and laughed outright, telling anyone in earshot that Sadie was building nothing more than a funeral fence made of dead flowers. Warren Pike went even further, wagering openly in front of the general store that the very first storm of the season would tear her creation apart and send it tumbling into the creek below. The work itself was slow and unglamorous, the kind of labor nobody ever wrote songs about. She spent whole afternoons testing the spacing between each bundle, standing back to study how the bare branches shifted in even a light breeze before deciding whether a gap needed to be widened or closed. Where the wind seemed likely to strike hardest, near the northwest corner where the land dipped slightly and funneled every gust directly toward the cabin, she doubled the thickness of the wall and drove extra stakes deep into the half-frozen ground to hold it steady. She learned to read the land the way her father had once read it, noticing how a slight rise here or a shallow gully there could change the entire path a storm might take once it reached her property. By the time the first frost arrived in earnest, the wall stretched nearly the full length of the cabin's exposed side, uneven in places, patched in others, but built with an understanding that no one else in the valley possessed. Sadie said nothing in return and simply kept working, her hands raw and cracked from the cold, each knot in the rope pulled tight before she moved on to the next. She was not building something beautiful to look at, and she had never intended to be. She was building a trap for the wind itself, a structure designed not to resist the storm head-on, but to rob it of its power before it ever arrived at her door. And every man who mocked her that autumn had no idea how close they would one day come to depending on it. November arrived earlier and colder than anyone in the valley could remember, and the change in the air was impossible to ignore, even for those who refused to take it seriously. The old-timers muttered that the wind smelled different that year, sharper somehow, carrying an edge that cut through wool the way it usually only cut through cotton. Crows flew low across the fields instead of circling high above them. Horses in the paddocks turned their hind quarters instinctively toward the north, and windows throughout the town began icing over from the inside rather than the outside. A sign the older residents took seriously, even if the younger ones did not. Sadie recorded every detail she observed in her father's old notebook, noting the direction of the wind each morning, the thickness of the frost, and the exact date the first real snowfall arrived, comparing each entry against the patterns her father had once taught her to read. The picture forming in those pages left little room for doubt in her mind. This year's northern wind was going to be stronger and angrier than anything the valley had faced in a very long time. She walked into town once more, not to ask for help this time, but to offer a warning, telling Cole Brantley that every household should build some kind of windbreak at least a few paces from their doors before the real storms arrived. Dean Mercer only laughed at the suggestion, insisting that his own home was built from good, honest timber and needed no lessons from a widow's flower patch. Warren Pike went further still, mocking her openly at the saloon and promising that if a real storm ever did come, he would personally ride out to strip every last flower from her wall and burn it for kindling. Sheriff Travis Boone did not laugh along with the others, but he did not take her seriously either, privately assuming that grief had simply left the widow more anxious than the situation truly called for. Naomi Vale, however, listened carefully to everything Sadie said, and without telling anyone, she quietly had her young son drag bundles of dry branches to the windward side of their own home, a small decision that would matter a great deal once the storm finally broke. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the sight of her own wall holding steady through the first sharp winds of the season might soften a few opinions, but pride in Bitterroot ran deeper than reason. Even the men who privately admired the neat, sturdy look of her handiwork would never have admitted it aloud, not while the story of the widow's flower wall still made for such easy laughter over cards and whiskey. Sheriff Boone, riding his usual rounds through town that week, noticed the tension building in the sky long before most of his neighbors did. Yet even he found himself unwilling to publicly side with a woman the whole valley had already decided to dismiss. Naomi's husband, a quiet man who rarely spoke against his wife's judgment, allowed her to finish the branch barrier without complaint, though he too kept his opinions on the matter carefully to himself whenever other men were within earshot. The warning Sadie carried into town that week fell on ears that had already made up their minds about her, long before she opened her mouth, and there was nothing left for her to do but return home and trust the work her own hands had already finished. A sense of foreboding settled over the reader of this story, the way frost settles over glass, quiet and certain, the knowledge that disaster was gathering strength in the mountains, while the town below continued about its business, as though nothing at all had changed. Only Sadie, and in her own small way Naomi, seemed to understand what was coming, while pride kept the rest of Bitterroot blind to a danger that was already closing in from the north. Not long after her warning went unheeded, an early gust of wind tore through the valley with more force than anyone expected for so early in the season, and a section of Sadie's carefully built wall buckled sideways under the strain. Dean Mercer happened to be riding past when it happened, and lost no time spreading the news that the widow's project had failed before winter had even truly begun. Sadie felt the sting of that failure deeply, but she did not let it stop her, and instead she walked the length of the damaged section slowly, studying exactly where and why it had given way. She found the trouble soon enough. The western base of the wall had not been weighted heavily enough with stone, and the ropes binding the stalks together had been tied too high, allowing the wind to twist and torque the bundles instead of holding them firm. For a single evening, Sadie allowed herself to feel the sting of doubt, sitting alone by her fire, and wondering whether a whole year of labor had been spent chasing a memory that no longer applied to this valley, this wind, this particular stretch of unfamiliar ground. But doubt had never been enough to stop her before, and it was not enough to stop her now. She rose the next morning, before first light, walked the length of the damaged wall twice over, and forced herself to look at the failure honestly rather than emotionally, the same way her father had once taught her to examine a broken wagon wheel without flinching from the cause. She rebuilt the weakened section with fresh eyes, burying more stone around the base to anchor it against the ground, lowering the rope bindings so the stalks could no longer twist against each other, and weaving the bundles into a crossed, lattice-like pattern instead of tying them in straight, rigid lines. In sections that caught the worst of the wind, she even trimmed away some of the heaviest dried flower heads, reducing the surface area that the gusts could grab hold of and pull against. This part of her work mattered because it revealed something honest about her character. Sadie was not some flawless genius who had solved every problem on her very first attempt. She tested her ideas, watched them fail, studied why, and adjusted, the same patient process her father had once used on the open plains of Kansas. A light snow drifted down one quiet night, not long after the repairs were finished, and by morning, Sadie discovered something she had been waiting months to see. For the first time in her memory, the snow had not piled against the rear door of her cabin the way it always had in years past. Instead, it had gathered in a long, harmless ridge just outside the sunflower wall, leaving the ground between the barrier and her home nearly bare. She smiled for the first time in many months as she stood in that small clearing of open earth, feeling something close to relief settle into her chest. Warren Pike rode by not long after, and saw the same thing she did, yet he brushed it aside with a shrug, telling her that a little snow proved nothing and that she ought to wait and see what a real storm could do. His words were meant as dismissal, but to anyone listening closely, they sounded more like a challenge thrown carelessly into the wind, one that the valley itself seemed determined to answer. By the first days of January, the sky over Bitterroot had turned the color of hammered lead, and an unnatural stillness settled over the valley that unsettled even those who prided themselves on reading the weather. The older residents shuttered their windows early that day without needing to be told why. Cattle grew restless in their pens for no apparent reason, and out at her cabin, Sadie studied the small wind vane she had mounted near her door and understood immediately that the thing she had been preparing for all year had finally arrived. Snow began falling that first night in thick, steady curtains, heavy but not yet dangerous, the kind of snowfall that lulled a person into thinking the worst had already passed. By midnight, however, the northern wind rose with a roar that sounded to some like an approaching freight train. Temperatures plunged to levels that could kill an exposed man within the hour, and throughout the town, walls groaned under gusts strong enough to drive snow sideways with the sharpness of blown sand. Inside her cabin, Sadie moved with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact night in her mind 100 times before it ever arrived. She banked the fire carefully, checked the seal around each window twice, and laid out dry kindling within easy reach in case she needed to feed the flames quickly during the worst of the night. Outside, the world had turned into a churning wall of white and gray, the kind of darkness that swallowed lantern light within a few feet and made the familiar shape of her own yard disappear entirely. She could hear the wind change pitch as it struck her property, a higher, thinner shriek where it caught the open plain and a lower, dragging groan where it met the resistance of her sunflower wall for the first time that season. Out at Sadie's cabin, the sunflower wall let out a long, low shriek as the wind tore through its gaps, and the dried stalks bent sharply under the pressure without ever snapping. The wind pushed through the loose weave of branches and stems, losing strength with every pass, until whatever snow it still carried simply dropped harmlessly outside the barrier instead of driving forward. Sadie checked at her back door and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that it had not been sealed shut by drifting snow. Her chimney remained clear, and the fire inside continued to burn steady and even. She sat down that night and wrote a single line in her father's old notebook. "The wind is stronger than last year, and the wall is still standing." While her small home held firm against the onslaught, the rest of the town began to suffer badly under the same storm that Sadie's wall had learned to tame. Dean Mercer's house started buckling along one side as drifts pressed relentlessly against its exposed wall, jamming his rear door shut within hours. Warren Pike's barn lost part of its roof entirely to the wind, and Cole Brantley's shop was buried so deeply at the front entrance that the door could no longer be opened from either side. The storm that had once seemed like an abstract threat, easily mocked and dismissed, was now testing every structure in the valley at once, and it was proving without mercy exactly which preparations had been sound and which had only ever been pried. The storm did not weaken on the second day, and by the third day it had grown into something the valley had never witnessed before. A blizzard so violent that even long-time residents admitted they had nothing in living memory to compare it to. Nobody in Bitterroot was laughing anymore. Out at the edge of town, Sadie's sunflower wall no longer resembled the flower patch it had once been mocked for. It had become something closer to a fortress built entirely of ice and dried stalks. Snow clung to every branch and stem until the entire structure was coated in a thick outer shell, and in a strange twist that even Sadie had not fully anticipated. That frozen coating became its own layer of insulation, further slowing the wind before it ever reached the open ground surrounding her cabin. This was the detail that mattered most in the entire ordeal. The wall did not defeat the storm through raw strength, the way a stone fortress might. It defeated the storm by turning the storm's own fury against itself, using every fresh gust of wind and every fresh load of snow to thicken and strengthen the very barrier meant to stop it. The more violently the blizzard threw itself against the valley, the denser and more effective Sadie's wall became, growing stronger with each hour that should have destroyed it. Sadie used the narrow path she had left between the wall and her cabin to reach her woodpile safely. Sheltered enough from the direct force of the wind that she never once risked being knocked from her feet, she kept her fire burning steadily throughout, and while her cabin was never warm in any luxurious sense, it remained safe, livable, and free from the killing cold tearing through the rest of the valley. Inside her small cabin, time seemed to slow into a rhythm of small, repeated tasks. Feeding the fire, checking the door, listening to the wind, and waiting for the gray light of morning to prove the wall had held through another night. She rationed her firewood carefully, aware that a fourth or fifth day of storm was not out of the question, given how the sky had looked before the first flakes fell. At one point during the second night, a particularly violent gust struck the northwest corner of the wall hard enough to rattle the cabin's own windows, and Sadie held her breath, waiting to hear the telltale crack of stalks snapping loose. The sound never came, and when she finally dared to look out through the frosted glass at first light, the wall stood exactly where she had left it, thicker now with packed snow but unbroken along its length. Naomi Vale and her 2 children survived those same 3 days, largely because of the crude branch barrier her son had dragged into place weeks earlier on Sadie's advice, a small act of trust that likely saved all 3 of their lives. Others were not so fortunate. Dean Mercer's home suffered a serious crack along one wall where snow had been allowed to press directly against unprotected timber. Cole Brantley lost an entire window to the force of the storm, and Warren Pike found himself trapped and injured while trying to save his livestock from a collapsing barn. On the third night of the storm, a weak and desperate knocking sounded against Sadie's cabin door, barely audible over the howling wind outside. It was Dean Mercer, his face pale with cold, one arm clutched tightly against his side, the very man who had once called her life's work a funeral fence made of dead flowers now standing helpless before it, shaking and begging to be let inside. Sadie looked at him through the gap in the door for a long moment, and she did not scold him, did not remind him of a single word he had once said about her. She simply opened the door and let him in out of the cold. By the morning of the fourth day, Sheriff Travis Boone had gathered a small group of men and fought his way toward Warren Pike's ranch after word spread that part of his barn had collapsed. They found the wealthy rancher injured at the leg and dangerously close to succumbing to the cold, his strength nearly spent after hours of exposure. There was no shelter close enough or safe enough to reach, except for the one place none of them had ever expected to need. And so, reluctantly, the sheriff and his men carried Warren toward the cabin at the edge of the valley. When Warren finally caught sight of the sunflower wall still standing firm against the storm, something shifted visibly in his expression, and the color that drained from his face had little to do with the cold. He understood in that moment, with a clarity that pride had kept from him for an entire year, that the very thing he had mocked without mercy was now the sole reason he still drew breath. Sadie welcomed him inside without hesitation, settling him near the fire, wrapping him in blankets, and pressing a cup of hot water into his shaking hands. Warren could not bring himself to meet her eyes, and after a long silence, he finally muttered that he had always assumed she planted those flowers simply because loneliness had gotten the better of her. Sadie's answer came quickly and without anger, spoken in a voice too calm to be anything but certain. "I planted them because I knew which way the wind travels," she said. It was a small sentence, but it carried the full weight of everything she had endured that year. A moment where dignity was reclaimed, not through shouting or revenge, but through simple, quiet truth. Sheriff Boone, watching the wall through the frost-covered window, finally understood the scope of what Sadie had accomplished. She had not only saved her own life through the long winter, she had, in the end, saved the lives of the very people who had spent an entire season laughing at her for trying. Boone began asking her, humbly and without a trace of his earlier doubt, how the other households in the valley might build similar barriers if the storm continued much longer, or if another one followed close behind. Sadie answered without hesitation, telling him that almost anything could serve the purpose if arranged correctly. Broken branches, dried cornstalks, splintered fence boards, coils of rope, empty barrels, even burlap sacks stuffed with straw. Warren lay quietly by the fire for a long while after that, watching Sadie move about her small kitchen with the same steady patience she had shown all year, and something in his expression suggested a man reckoning honestly with himself for perhaps the first time in a long while. He had built his entire reputation in the valley on confidence and certainty, on knowing better than everyone around him, and now he owed his life to the very person he had spent a year holding up for ridicule. Dean Mercer, still recovering in the corner of the same crowded room, said little, but his eyes followed Sadie with a quiet, chastened respect that no words could have expressed more clearly. Word spread quickly among the survivors, sheltering together in that small cabin, and by the time the worst of the storm had passed, the entire town had begun learning survival lessons from the very widow they had dismissed as foolish only months before. It was a quiet, unspoken kind of victory, one that asked for no applause and received none, yet it changed the way an entire valley would think about pride, about assumptions, and about the people they had once been too quick to judge. After many long days, the storm finally broke, and the first sunlight in nearly a week spilled down over the battered valley of Bitterroot. Roofs had caved in across the town. Barns lay in splintered ruins, and fences had vanished entirely beneath drifts taller than a grown man. Yet at the far edge of the valley, Sadie's small cabin still stood exactly where it always had. The sunflower wall no longer carried its golden summer glow. Its stalks were bent. Several sections had cracked under the strain, and the whole structure was sheathed in a thick coat of frost and old snow. But it had done precisely what it was built to do, and it had done it until the very last hour of the storm. News of what had happened traveled quickly through the surviving households of the valley, and the mocking name that had followed Sadie for an entire year quietly disappeared from use. People stopped calling it the widow's flower wall, and began instead to call it the Whitlock windbreak, a name spoken now with something closer to respect than ridicule. When spring finally returned to Bitterroot, Warren Pike offered to pay Sadie handsomely for the secret behind her design, but she refused his money outright. Instead, she asked only that he send lumber and supplies to the other widows scattered throughout the valley before the following winter arrived, a request he honored without argument. Naomi Vale spent the early days of that spring helping Sadie gather seed from what remained of the storm-damaged flower heads, and together the two women divided the harvest among the families of Bitterroot. For the first time in the valley's history, sunflowers were not planted for their beauty alone. They were planted because people had finally learned, through hard experience, that they could mean the difference between life and death when the northern wind came. Calling again. Sadie herself never sought recognition for what she had done, and in the years that followed, she remained much the same quiet, watchful woman she had always been. More comfortable tending her rows of sunflowers than accepting praise from men who had once mocked her openly in the street. She rebuilt her portion of the wall each autumn without fail. A little wiser and more efficient with every passing season, and travelers who stopped in Bitterroot often remarked on the strange beauty of a valley ringed with golden flowers standing guard before every home. The friendship between Sadie and Naomi Vale deepened over the years that followed, the two women often working side by side through planting season, trading seeds and small pieces of hard-won wisdom the way old friends trade stories by a fire. Years later, children would run laughingly past tall rows of sunflowers growing beside cabins throughout the valley, with little understanding of the winter that had once nearly claimed the entire town through nothing more than stubborn pride. But the older residents remembered, and they would tell the story of Sadie Whitlock to anyone willing to listen. The widow who understood that sometimes the most fragile thing standing before a person is the very thing that ends up standing between life and death. They had laughed at her once for planting flowers outside her door, but when the storm finally came, it was those same flowers that taught an entire town how to survive.